It's my Nerd World, a Star Wars show, and thank you so much for joining this week's episode where I talk about Bad Batch Season 3 and the first 3 episodes. I'll explain why I titled the podcast the way that I did. We'll get into rampant speculation based off of what was revealed in these first 3 episodes, and we'll dive into your listener feedback this week. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com is where you can email me. And as always, if you want to support my nerd world and you like to read, check out the science fiction space opera series EMBARK. Available on Amazon.com under EMBARK, Jon, Jon Justice, or at mynerdworld.net. Now, let's get to this week's show.
It's an instinct. Feeling. The Force brought us together. We're not alone. Good people will fight if we lead them.
People keep telling me they know me. No one does.
But I do.
Long have I waited, and now you're coming together. Is your undoing. Confronting fear is the destiny of a Jedi. Your destiny.
The Force will be with you.
Always.
My Nerd World.
And welcome to it. I'm your host, Jon Justice. Pleased to be able to talk and speculate once again about that galaxy far, far away called Star Wars. With the final season of The Bad Batch and the first 3 episodes dropping this week, I didn't really know what to expect. I've enjoyed The Bad Batch. If you've been listening to the show for any length of time, you know my thoughts on The Bad Batch. It's a real fun watch, not something that has had me clamoring to return to watch over and over again. We do end up getting a bit of an adventure of the week with some episodes that tie into the larger story. And certainly with these first 3 episodes of Bad Batch Season 3, it appears that we are getting a bit of that, an adventure of the week, especially with the second episode, but also definitely not wasting any time by telling the larger story and making sure we're keeping up with the characters that we care so much about, whether it be Crosshair and Omega, and their story, getting them back. That second episode did have that bit of the, it's filler episode, but it wasn't. It was obviously leading to their finding Omega and Crosshair. Needless to say, I was really kind of blown away. I was surprised at the way these first few episodes unfolded, and it seemed like a really brave choice for how they opened up the first 3 episodes in this final series of The Bad Batch. I titled the show this week, Bad Batch Season 3, not the Star Wars we deserve, but the one we need, because it is a bit of a risk in opening up with this first episode that was a slow burn, and we don't get a lot of good slow burns anymore when it comes to our storytelling. I want to get into a little bit more of that and talk about more of a bit of a meta angle on these first few episodes, and especially that first episode in Season 3. And then we'll dive into the speculation, which I'm really excited to get into, because off these first 3 episodes, it's doing what I've wanted Star Wars to do and what I think Star Wars does best in its current iteration of storytelling and content creation. And that is filling in these gaps of time and completing these stories that we've received. It all started with the original trilogy, hearing you fought in the Clone Wars, and then, of course, we end up getting that with the prequel trilogy, and then we jump ahead in time with the sequel trilogy, and we have Snoke, and we have a First Order, and we don't really know what their origins are, and now we have the filling in of that backstory, in the same way that we got a filling in of the stories between Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith with the Clone Wars. They're doing a fantastic job of doing that. And as an individual who loves the sequel trilogy, I've been clamoring to get the backstory of how we ended up with those tales, and now it's all starting to take place. And so I'm really excited to talk about it. But first, let's start here, because there's a benefit to these first 3 episodes for the younger generation that I'm really happy to see. And I'll share a bit of my own experience and relate it to why I think an episode like episode 1 of season 3 of The Bad Batch is really important for the Gen Zers out there to watch.
Something inside me has always been there. But now it's awake. And I need help.
Our attention spans just aren't what they used to be anymore. In a TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, X world where we are becoming, and especially the younger generations, are becoming so accustomed to these snippets of content. They can't hold their attention on something for very long. That's why I love movies and going to the movie theater, and why I personally feel, while it's entertainment, it's important for my boys, and especially for my youngest, Kyle, 17 years old, and Logan before him is 21, to still go to a theater, to put their phone completely away, to sit there and watch a story unfold. In not real time, but certainly not the completely unrealistic time that your TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube world presents in TikTok videos and reels and stories that we see. There's a slow burn element to episode 1 of season 3 of The Bad Batch that I think is really good for children and Gen Zers to be exposed to, because it also had incredible storytelling. Go back and watch that first episode again. There's an underlying ominous tone throughout the whole thing, and little nods to a ticking clock. While the story itself isn't filled with a lot of action and a lot of jump shots and explosions, it's really just about these individuals going through their own personal situations in an animated format. The animation, look, I'm just dispense of this quickly. The animation is absolutely stunning. It's absolutely stunning. The use of light, dust particles, still keeping that Clone Wars aesthetic, but adding in just this very tactile and real feel to it. It's just absolutely incredible. But go back and watch that first episode again. It's a complete slow burn, but it's almost entrancing and almost haunting. The ticking clock of the blood vials, especially when we know that Omega's blood is in there, and the expectation that her blood is going to be the one that won't cause any sort of degradation with the specimen that's being dropped into it, which I assume is the blood of Palpatine, and we'll get to that in just a moment. The dripping water in her cell. And you watch that dripping water, it's empty when the episode starts and slowly begins to fill up. For those not paying close enough attention, about 5 months pass since the beginning of episode 1 through those 3 episodes. You have the hash marks on the wall that indicate a passage of time. You can tell that that Wrecker and Hunter's armor has been through the ringer, and I won't go through all of the indications, but when you calculate her hash marks on the wall and a couple of other items, you'll figure out that there's about a 5-month timeline that we go through in these first three episodes, and there are all of these little indications of time ticking and going by, and it keeps the story running while we're really just watching individuals go about their routine, and the intrigue begins to build. That's a benefit for a younger generation. My son Kyle was so excited to watch these episodes, and I was really interested to see just how locked in he would be. From the moment that episode 1 started, I was like, oh, they're really going brave with this. We're not getting the sort of action-packed openings that we had in previous seasons. And as the episode is progressing, I'm getting sucked into all this and really enjoying it. But I'm very curious to know, is this losing Kyle? Is it keeping his interest? And it absolutely did. That type of world-building, content creation, and storytelling, it is crucial for young people to be able to go and absorb that, because it transfers into real life and your attention spans. My wife Melinda was getting into it as well. And again, going back to why I titled the episode the way that I did, I'm surprised that they went this route at a time when Star Wars is struggling, for lack of a better word, and you look at the burnout that people have. I know that Ahsoka wasn't as well received as they probably expected, even though it did well. I certainly loved it. I've expressed my love of that show. I think it's awesome, and I think there's a lot of those same sorts of tensions and slow burn in Ahsoka as well. But I really thought that it was a very bold choice to go the way that they did with these first 3 episodes. Of course, in episode 2, you do get that adventure. You wonder if Hemlock had created that creature, and what had ultimately taken over their the operation there on the planet, where they're trying to go and get the data to track down Omega. And again, I could wipe out on all that. I'm not going to, because I want to get to the stuff that I'm really, really, really hyped about. But that was a fun storytelling, seeing those younger clones being cast off and the connections that they have there, almost to a point where I wanted those clones that they found that have been left behind to join them on these missions, but clearly they're going to end up putting them on the water planet from the previous episode. And then just the masterful work of the 3rd episode, which when it ended, it just has me clamoring to watch the rest of them, and very thankful that we're doing these once a week as opposed to dropping it all at once, because there's no way that I would not have been able to hold back from watching the next episodes. I'm just really excited at the storytelling, and I like it when they're willing to take risks, and this seemed like a risk to me. Not starting off with a bang, but starting off with this very heavy storytelling from what essentially is a kid's show. But let's get into the meat of this, because the thing that I'm most excited about is what is going on with Palpatine. How long has he been working on this plan? And where is this all going to lead and head into relating to the sequel trilogy?
This is not going to go the way you think.
So here's some of the broad strokes. First off, it was amazing to see Palpatine, seeing him arrive on the planet at the facility, seeing the old school doing that thing with my fingers, royal guards come walking off to stake their place out on either side of him. Just absolutely spectacular. It brought back so many of those old original trilogy vibes. But the first question that I have was at the first mention of the Necromancer project, which was also mentioned in the last season of The Mandalorian, is like, goodness gracious, how long has Palpatine been working on his backup plan? And this is clearly still the plan moving forward into the Mandoverse. Now, one can easily go and extrapolate that they don't end up getting Omega because they haven't been able to complete the Project Necromancer, because, again, we're looking at the same project being worked on, even though there's an offshoot of it with Moff Gideon in the Mandalorian series. It's clear that the core of what they are trying to accomplish with Grogu in getting his blood is to continue Operation Necromancer, which we end up seeing come to fruition by the time we get to the original trilogy. The sequel trilogy. First, of course, being introduced to Snoke in The Force Awakens and then seeing it come to its full fruition in The Rise of Skywalker to have Palpatine go and utter those words, "I created Snoke." We're seeing the beginnings of that now, and only before having it heard sort of mentioned by name, and then what we've seen in The Mandalorian, going back to about 17 years before the Battle of Yavin, which is where we're at in The Bad Batch, we see just how long since Palpatine's been in power that he's been working on this particular plan. So, the question that I have, how much of this is going to lead into Dave Filoni's Mandoverse movie? Because clearly all of these things are tying together. And while you do get a storytelling gap relating to the original trilogy where we step back away from Project Necromancer, it certainly will be at the front of your mind when you go back and watch Return of the Jedi now, and we see Palpatine in the original trilogy for the first time, and we know that when he ultimately meets his demise, he's been laying the groundwork all along that the end is not really the end. It'll be interesting to see whether or not we ever get a direct answer to how Palpatine was able to do what he did being thrown down the shaft on the Death Star 2, leading to his return in The Rise of Skywalker and Snoke, except to say that maybe Palpatine did die on the Death Star 2 in Return of the Jedi. And what we're seeing is actually just a clone of Palpatine that has Force powers. Now, I would push back against that a bit, considering the way that The Rise of Skywalker plays out at the end, with Palpatine's desire for Rey to strike him down at the end of that film, spoiler alert, and to take his place, and that they will become one together. I tend to believe that Palpatine's consciousness ends up going through the dark side, whatever clone that he has created of himself, of which Snoke will be a part of that. I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but that's what I think ultimately happens, is that Palpatine creates a clone of himself. He's able to transfer his consciousness in that moment of being destroyed on the Death Star 2, and what we're seeing is a resurrected Snoke, his Force soul, dark side soul, ending up in a clone that he's created of himself, not powerful enough to completely take form as of yet when we see it in The Rise of Skywalker, and therefore temporarily being in Snoke at the beginning of the sequel trilogy. But let's step out of Star Wars for just a moment and talk a little bit about inspiration. Dune Part 2 is coming out next week. Can't wait to see it. Many people are saying it's a masterpiece, one of the best science fiction films they've ever seen. I loved the first Dune. I understand people's reservations with the first Dune, being that it had a lot of heavy lifting to do in world building. Apparently, this all pays off in Dune Part 2, which I cannot wait to see. But we also know that George Lucas was heavily inspired by Dune and Frank Herbert's writing, the author of the book. Frank Herbert himself was inspired by Isaac Asimov, and specifically Foundation. Now, if you're not familiar with Foundation, in the Foundation story, there is what they call Empire. And Empire is entirely built off the idea of clones. The original emperor, who they called Empire, made clones of himself. And they are Day, Dawn, and Dusk. So different generations of the same empire, the same person. So Dusk is the ruler, with Day and Dawn being the youngest, Day being the middle, ready to go and take their place. And when Dusk passes away, there's a new Dawn that is birthed, or essentially taken out of a cryotube, who is the baby version, and it repeats, so that Empire always has the same emperor moving forward. It seems pretty clear that the inspiration for George Lucas, or the inspiration of the individuals that are now currently involved in the storytelling, was taken from Empire and Foundation, meaning that Palpatine always had a plan to go and have himself cloned to continue on with his rule in perpetuity. And I love the connections here and what they're trying to do. Star Wars is obviously doing it much differently than what they had done in Foundation, but the threads of inspiration are still there and laid out. Palpatine all along had an idea of how he was going to go and stay in power. And again, stepping out of the story, and we'll get back into the details of the story here in just a moment, so many complaints about the sequel trilogy not having a plan, and I completely respect those complaints and I understand. And it's clear that J.J. Abrams created the first story, probably didn't have any thoughts whatsoever at the time, despite what you may have heard. Probably didn't have any thoughts at the time about Snoke being a clone of Palpatine, maybe in the back of their head. They were just looking for another big bad who could be running the show since Palpatine was dead. Rian Johnson comes in, ends up creating his own story with The Last Jedi and continues it, and then J.J. Abrams takes over the mantle once again after Colin Trevorrow, and his idea gets pitched off. So when we get to the writing of The Rise of Skywalker, we get the return of Palpatine. What's interesting to me is that with the complaints of having no plan at all, essentially, for the original for the sequel trilogy, that ends up getting remedied with The Rise of Skywalker. If you look at the timeline of when Bad Batch Season 1 came out, and specifically Mandalorian Season 1 dropping before The Rise of Skywalker came out, all of these stories were being written in tandem. And I would venture a guess that they had a plan all along that, you know what, bring Palpatine back, have him be the one who created Snoke. We'll fill in the backstory with these other stories that we're going to tell in The Bad Batch and The Mandalorian. And we'll use this as a storytelling mechanism, if you will. We'll use this as a thread in our storytelling of The Bad Batch and The Mandalorian that will eventually all lead into the sequel trilogy. It's also an answer to when Dave Filoni had talked about so long ago that eventually The Mandalorian would end up showing and exposing the seeds of the First Order. We still have a long way to go until we find out how the military buildup took place, exactly what happened relating to Snoke and where did he come from. All that we know right now is that Snoke was a strand cast. So there's already allusions there that this was something that was created, and we know that was created because Palpatine said as much in The Rise of Skywalker. A lot of people are speculating that Hemlock could end up becoming Snoke. The guy's weird, he's creepy, he's looking more and more like Snoke in the show, and while he's not tall enough yet, we've got a lot of things going on with Hemlock that are very interesting and strange. And it wouldn't be all that surprising to me to eventually see Hemlock go and say, I'm going to be the one to have my body take on and possess that of the Emperor in his absence. There's a reason why something's going on with his black gloved hand. There's a reason why Hemlock talks the way that he does and is as creepy as he is. And a lot of people are speculating that it could potentially be Snoke. Now, there's also the possibility that when they go into the necromancer room, which we still don't know exactly what's in there, that maybe there's a body in there that resembles Snoke as well. But clearly we're heading in this direction, and that's the reason why they're trying to find blood to go along with Palpatine's, because all the specimens they've used so far show signs of degradation of the midichlorians, as they're calling M-count now to get away from the midichlorian label. And it's Omega's blood that ends up being the one that works the best with Palpatine's blood. So let's get into that a bit. Because there's been a lot of, from what I've heard of the commentary so far, some people were speculating that because Palpatine's blood showed no M-count degradation with her specimen in the show, that means that Omega is Force sensitive. It's not necessarily the case, though. At the moment, Omega seems to be the only living clone to have midichlorians successfully transferred to her body when she was originally created, again, with no degradation from the specimen. And I've pulled a couple of different comments here from Reddit, things that I was thinking as well, but people had articulated this in such a way that I felt it was easier on the show to go and share with you some of the thoughts of others that I completely agree with and what I was thinking. Basically, Omega is what Palpatine was trying to perfect on Exegol after his death. Another similar success was Rey's father. His name was actually Dathan, for those that don't know. But he was deemed a failure despite not suffering any disfiguration or degradation due to his low midichlorian count. Omega is indeed one special clone. It's also implying that the Commonians did manage to perfect the cloning of Force sensitives. And this is mentioned and referenced very upfrontly. Is that even a word, up front? This is mentioned on its face in The Mandalorian in what Moff Gideon was trying to do. He was trying to get his clones to be Force sensitive. So all of this is really leading to Exegol, going back to Hemlock working on Project Necromancer all the way through the original trilogy, all the way through the Mandoverse, and then into the sequel trilogy. So you're looking at some 30 years, some 3 decades. This also lines up with other material in the books and comics, which indicates that the Emperor had basically been working on cloning to extend his life on Exegol from the get-go. So my best guess is that Palpatine cloned himself, and there's been a clone of himself just sitting somewhere, very much in the same way that Moff Gideon did when there were all those Moff Gideons in those big, gigantic tanks. Palpatine had one sitting there, and he was just looking for the ability to go and bring it back to its full life again. So after years of manipulating his way to achieve galactic control, right, he's basically found a way to extend his life. And what's really interesting to me is whether or not this eventually all goes back to the conversation that Palpatine ended up having with Anakin Skywalker in Revenge of the Sith and Darth Plagueis. I'm wondering if this path to immortality, right? He literally tells Anakin if they work together, they can discover the path to immortality. So he planted these seeds for decades, and whether or not, and it seems pretty clear as I kind of work this out in my head, this is what he was talking about. He never had the ability, really, to go and save Padme, but he could go and save himself, but it was going to require a lot of work. Now, there's another angle on this, too, that I wanted to share, just based off of what we know from the trailer for the Bad Batch, and that is the return of Asajj Ventress. So, for those that don't know, Asajj Ventress, there was a novel that came out, and she died in the novel. So, everybody was very surprised to see her show up in the trailers for the Bad Batch. But now that we know what's happening with Necromancer, and considering that they've mentioned extracting material, right, and doing more cloning, the fact that Asajj Ventress shows up later in the series, she could either be a corpse or a clone grown from her own DNA that the Republic covertly gathered on her burial on Dathomir from the book. I just really love the way that we're going, and we're continuing to lean into that which George Lucas started with cloning. And now with this new batch of storytelling, with George Lucas no longer being involved, they're continuing to lean into the cloning and taking full advantage of what that can offer, and specifically in telling the backstory of what's happening with Palpatine. Now, I realize that in this commentary I didn't come to a lot of conclusions, and that's because we don't know all the answers yet. But I find it really compelling and fun that we're watching this new Star Wars content, which is always good, right? And we're beginning to see unfold Palpatine's ultimate plan and the whole reason why he ended up coming back to so much controversy in the sequel trilogy, especially in The Rise of Skywalker. And I said before, and I'll continue to say it, those movies are going to be looked back upon more fondly than they are now, just in the same way that the prequel trilogy was. There will be those that will be curmudgeons, and everybody has a right to do so, that'll say, well, they're just making up for the mistakes they made in the sequel trilogy. You know what? So what? Who cares? They're doing some great storytelling, and it's fascinating to see now Palpatine being even more evil than he was before, and exposing more of what's the word I'm looking for? I don't want to say tactical is not the right word. How conniving, how nefarious he is, and just how intent and evil he was, that he just doesn't ever want to relinquish control. it's only going to enhance the sequel trilogy. And I, for one, have been holding off on my rewatch after watching The Force Awakens and Last Jedi about a month ago on my rewatch of The Rise of Skywalker, and I do not think I'll be doing that anymore. The last bit I'll leave you with is I'm interested to see whether or not Ahsoka plays into any of this. When it comes to Thrawn, when it comes to the Night Sisters, the cargo on board the Chimera that's now on Dathomir. My guess is it doesn't have anything to do with this, that this is a separate thing taking place. And as I've speculated on previous episodes, I wonder whether Palpatine is going to see what's happening with Thrawn and that it ends up being a bit of a threat to what he's trying to accomplish, having Thrawn ascend and becoming a threat, thinking that he was completely out of the way. The Dark Sisters being separate from Palpatine's grander plan, and his stepping in to remove Thrawn from the equation, and perhaps with the armies that Thrawn has built, or off the back of what Thrawn accomplishes in the Ahsoka series, we get the beginnings of the First Order. All of this is to say, love these first 3 episodes. Really surprised that they took what, in my view, is a risk. Not that they could have known that Star Wars would kind of be in the social sphere place that it is right now, not being looked upon with a lot of favoritism. I was disappointed because the Big Thing podcast that I listen to in Christian Harloff, they typically do their Star Wars show, and they did a Star Wars show this week, and none of them decided to watch the show. And that's a big bummer to me, because here we have some of the most detailed mythology and speculation that we've had in a long, long time relating to the large story that's being told of the Skywalkers. Much more so than Ahsoka. They're speculating it can be done with Ahsoka, but nothing is close to the seeds that were planted during these first 3 episodes of Bad Batch, and commentary from individuals that I typically enjoy, they didn't even bother watching it. Makes me wonder how many people are watching it. I hope they are, because this shouldn't just be for hardcore Star Wars fans. This is what Star Wars needs to do more of, giving individuals like myself and others out there the opportunity to speculate and continue to draw upon those stories that we've all fallen in love with, despite the recent controversies that Star Wars, Lucasfilm, and Disney has had as of late. As always, though, what do you think? Am I off my rocker? Did you enjoy the story being told and seeing these little seeds of Operation, of Project Necromancer and where this is heading with Palpatine? Are you as interested in this as I am? Drop me an email, talkshownerd@gmail.com. Always love to hear from you. And speaking of which, let's go ahead and get to your listener feedback this week.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
My most watched Star Wars podcast is my Reylo, the greatest love story Star Wars ever told. And it seems like every other month or so, it ends up getting kicked up in the algorithm, and it ends up garnering more views than it had before. And people start watching it, and I get a smattering of emails that come in. And it's happened again this week. I got a couple of listener feedbacks with regard to that particular show, The Greatest Love Story Star Wars Ever Told, talking about Reylo. Raven Lenore writes, in The Last Jedi, when Rey is going to Snoke's ship, she's in a narrow ship. I think her ship is kind of like a coffin, in a fairy tale, like Snow White. She's in a coffin, and the prince is in there when she wakes up. When Rey arrives in her coffin-like ship, Kylo is there when it opens. And these are the types of questions that I would love to talk to Rian Johnson about if I ever had the opportunity to sit down and interview him, as somebody that thinks that The Last Jedi is a masterpiece. But thank you so much for the listener feedback, Raven, and I tend to agree with your assessment. And it falls in line with Rey letting her hair down and all of the different aspects of mythology that I believe Rian Johnson drew upon when crafting his Reylo story. Oh My Dog 9 writes, with regard to the same podcast, I wholeheartedly agree with your take, and I'm so pleased you've put a voice out there singing the praises for the sequel trilogy and the central arc of these two characters. I just wanted to say that your comments around the finger touching in the context of neither having had any experience before reminds me a lot of the scene between Keira Knightley in the Keira Knightley Pride and Prejudice film, where Darcy takes her hand to assist her into the carriage, and when she walks away, the camera momentarily focuses on his hand stretching out. It was a simple moment of context, but in the context of that period where men and women rarely had much physical contact, bowing, curtsying, etc., and the fact that there was a brewing attraction between Darcy and Elizabeth, that hand contact must have felt electric. Great way to describe it. There's a couple ways you could have gone on that, and I like the way that you described that being electric. Or as I like to call it in the sequel trilogy relating to Reylo, finger touch and lovin'. So, Oh My Dog 9, thank you so much for the listener feedback this week. Ray 2017 writes, Lucasfilm should not make any more spin-off shows that keep bringing us further back. Unless it's the High Republic or Old Republic or any era of the First Jedi era. I want to see more Mandoverse stuff and then go beyond the Episode 9 timeline. Lucasfilm doesn't realize how much of a clean slate they have here with Rey. If they really want to push her to the forefront of the spotlight, then let's at least keep pushing for that. Pushing for this future and learn to let go. What more is there to see aside from anything before the prequels? I want them to move on from that because it isn't fair to the rest of us that want us to move on. If they want the rest of us of the fandom to embrace Rey even more, then we need to see more then we need to see her more, and they need to give her more time to develop. I'm sorry for all this ranting, but honestly, I'm tired of all this back and forth. It needs to change. Thank you for the comment, Ray. I respectfully disagree, and I think this podcast kind of shows why. I love the fact that they're filling in these gaps, and I love the Mandoverse stories that are being told. It is very much in the Star Wars tradition to tell these stories in different eras. Now, I think eventually you're going to fill up all these timelines, and certainly the space between Episode 3 and Episode 4 is just about all filled up with these particular stories, but it doesn't mean there can't be other offshoot stories that don't connect to the Skywalker story overall that could be told. But I personally love the filling in of these gaps, especially between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens. That being said, I'm also very much with you. I want to see the story move forward. I'm looking forward to seeing what they do with Rey. I'm cautiously optimistic, if not trepidatious, about the individuals that they have tasked to go and create this feature film. We'll see how this whole thing shakes out. Needless to say, I am very interested to see what story they are going to tell. I just hope they don't go and screw it up. All right, that wraps up the show for this week. If you're a newer listener to the show and you like to read, check out my science fiction space opera series, EMBARK. 7 books in all in the series tells a complete story. The first 3 books are a complete trilogy that wraps up the story. Book 4, Gahan, Corbijn, and the Asteroid of Misfortune, is a one-off solo adventure where you can read it on its own or as a sequel to Book 3, The Vanishing War, and a prequel to Book 4, The Rocket Queen, whereas Book 5, The Rocket Queen, whereas Books 5, 6, and 7 are also a trilogy. But start off with Book 1, EMBARK, Book 1, that's simple. After Earth faces its end, follow pilots Taft, Katha, and their crew on a journey of survival across the galaxy as they fight for humanity's future. It's written for adults, but great for ages 11 plus. Pick up EMBARK Book 1 today. You can get it in an ebook for just 99 cents. You can get the complete 7-book series in ebook for just $3.99. It's also available in Kindle Unlimited, audiobook, all 7 books, paperback and hardcover, and you can purchase your paperback and hardcover copies directly from me at a cheaper price than what you'll buy them on Amazon, and also with much cheaper shipping. So if you like your science fiction space opera to be epic, filled with some romance, action, and really cool technology, and you love Star Wars, EMBARK is perfect for you. And it's great for ages 11 plus, even though I wrote it for adults, as I mentioned a moment ago. Think Star Wars in terms of there's no language or any explicit content or anything like that. Again, on Amazon.com or mynerdworld.net. If you head on over to Amazon, just search for Jon, Jon Justice, and EMBARK. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode as much as I did recording, and I look forward to hearing from you. Drop me an email, talkshownerd@gmail.com. Until next week, I hope wherever you are happy, you are healthy, you are safe, and I can't wait to see where Project Necromancer is heading next in episode 4 of The Bad Batch. I'll talk to you then. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My Nerd World.